Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome back to our closing session. If you are just now joining us, my name is Dr. Michelle Bowers, and I am the proud president-elect for CAAASA and superintendent for Lancaster School District. And I would like to thank you all for choosing to join us and be a part of our 2020 CAAASA Roundup. I hope that you have enjoyed this morning's speakers, and I am confident that you enjoyed the workshops. Very powerful information, and thank you to all of our presenters for joining us today and being part of this fantastic experience. Just a reminder that our general session, as well as our workshops that were provided today, have been recorded this morning. So if you missed any part of the roundup or would like to check out any of the other workshops that you didn't attend, we will have the recordings on the CAAASA YouTube channel. And as soon as those are available, we will be sending out an email notification. So we'll make sure that you get that information and you'll be able to share those with some colleagues or be able to check out some of the other workshops. So thank you again for choosing to join us. Now, as promised, thank you for coming back because we do have a strong finish for you this morning. We are very delighted and honored to be joined today by Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, an internationally known researcher and educator. Dr. Darling-Hammond currently serves as president of the California State Board of Education and president of the Learning Policy Institute, created to provide high-quality research for policies that enable equitable and empowering education for each and every child. Dr. Darling-Hammond is also the Charles E. Dukeman Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University. Welcome and thank you for joining us. It is indeed an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to have you as part of our roundup today. So Dr. Darling-Hammond, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. It's so good to see you. And I want to also thank our director, Dwight Bond, and President Daryl Camp for putting on this amazing event over the last couple of days. As a longtime member of CAAASA's Board of Directors, I am so proud of the organization's role in educating the state, as well as sharing best practices across local communities. And the theme this year of strengthening equity coalitions could not be more timely. As you well know, we are experiencing three crises in the world and in the country. And we have an economic crisis, we have a public health crisis, and we have a civil rights crisis. All of these disproportionately are impacting Black children and families and communities of color in the state. The policing violence that we have seen on the streets, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many, many other, there's been a series of events, have actually also long existed in schools. We know that just as Black people are racially profiled and over-policed in communities, Black children have been criminalized and targeted by discriminatory discipline practices in schools that suspend and expel them disproportionately. Schools serving Black students are more likely to have metal detectors and police officers than they are to have school counselors, school nurses, or mental health professionals. And studies find that the presence of police in schools has often led to arrest and physical abuse of children, especially Black students, without increasing safety. Children as young as 5 or 6 years old have been arrested, handcuffed, suspended, and sometimes expelled for acts as small as having a butter knife in their backpack, or texting during class, or failing to respond to a question or a command. High rates of school exclusion are not due to worse behavior, but because of harsher treatment for minor offenses, such as tardiness or talking in class, or even wearing natural hairstyles. These harsh punishments increase the chances of students dropping out, and they feed the school to prison pipeline. Meanwhile, investments in social and emotional learning, restorative practices, mental health supports, as well as community schools providing health and social services that address the trauma many students experience, pay off in stronger relationships, safer schools, and better achievement. And CAAASA has been at the forefront of putting forward that agenda for many years. So we have to ask, given the outcomes, why aren't all schools doing what works? We must acknowledge that the status quo is untenable, and we must act to implement policies and practices that support all students. Leaders in many districts are either ending contracts with police departments or ensuring training in culturally competent and supportive practices in restorative justice, including those officers. Either way, we need to create the environment in schools where all children are trusted, where they are seen as valuable and loved, and in which we are making the investments in them that they deserve. As you know, this is just one manifestation of inequalities in education that we have been dealing with for many, many, many decades, indeed centuries. The inequalities in resources and opportunities that we see in society generally, in terms of resources, access to qualified teachers, high quality curriculum, are played out in schools. We're making progress on this agenda in California because of the efforts of members of CAAASA and so many other people of conscience across the state. We're making progress with the local control funding formula, with more equitable distribution of funds to districts. We need to ensure that those funds are equitably distributed within districts as well to the children whose needs are greatest. And in that spirit, we need to understand the situation for Black students in California. When we look at the trends in achievement, we see, trends going up, but the gaps are not closing as rapidly for Black students as they are for others. Most Black students in California are actually in only 25 districts. They are in the highest poverty schools in those districts. The schools are typically highly segregated, as well as very high poverty. In the state, about 1 in 5 schools have more than 90% of their students living in poverty. And in those schools, more than 95% of the students are African American and Latinx students. African American students who are doing well academically are in schools that have better trained teachers, more experienced teachers. We did a study called Positive Outliers at Learning Policy Institute, where we looked at the districts where African American and Latinx students and white students were all outperforming the norms for their groups. And what we found was that they invested in stable, well-prepared teachers and school leaders. They created those pipelines for superintendents who would stay and be members of the community and really committed to the schools. They invested in the social emotional learning and wraparound supports, as well as finely tuned academic support for progress. But African American students who are in the schools that are doing least well academically are in schools that have extraordinarily high proportions of uncertified and inexperienced teachers. And I'm talking about 50, 60, 70, 80% of new teachers coming in without training and without experience, creating a churn because they don't stay very long. And you cannot improve schools without building the capacity of the educator workforce with competent and diverse teachers and school leaders. The other thing we know is from Pedro Noguera's study of Black students in the Los Angeles area, the very high rates of homelessness, food insecurity, and trauma that students experience. So when we think about the advocacy that is needed from equity coalitions at the state level, at the local level, and indeed even at the federal level, where I'm happy to say that CAAASA is now engaging as well. There are at least 5 things that I think we need to be focusing on. One is we need to continue to focus on closing the digital divide. We've been making progress on that in California. We're focused on it, but we need to get over the finish line because the children who have lacked devices and connectivity to engage in education, particularly last spring, belong to families that also lack devices and connectivity to get telehealth, to be able to apply for jobs, to be able to get benefits, to be able to call Instacart, rather than sending grandma to the store. to be exposed to COVID. So both children and families, particularly in communities of color, and particularly in communities with high levels of poverty, need this to be solved now. It is just a huge foundation for education and also for a life situation that is able to be sustained in this time. We're probably somewhere between half and 2/3 of the way in closing our digital divide in California. Happy that T-Mobile and Apple just stepped up with 1 million devices that will be coming into the communities that are still waiting for them in the supply chain, with iPads that also have hotspots attached. But we still have more work to do. We've got to get an infrastructure broadband policy in the state. There's a task force working on it, but we need that to happen. We need investments in being sure that districts who have reached into their reserves, as you well know, have reached into your reserves to do what's needed for the children. And that, of course, then leaves a fiscally dangerous cliff that many people are facing because as they try to meet the needs that kids have for devices, for meals, for connectivity, for wraparound supports, they're jeopardizing their financial stability. We are lucky so far that the state has managed not to cut budgets as so many other states are doing, but we need more resources in that regard. And that's going to be an important place for equity coalitions. Some of that advocacy is going to need to be at the federal level. There's a bill stuck in the Senate that would potentially send $100 billion to schools in the United States to enable them to have stability and staffing to open up safely. We need to be very forceful in the advocacy around that agenda as well. We need to continue to advocate for a diverse and well-trained teaching force in all of our schools. Districts can't do this alone. If there's not a supply of teachers and leaders, you can't magically create it. The state has a role in that. We are continuing to face shortages. We need to continue the teacher residency programs that so many cities have begun. We need to continue the Grow Your Own programs that both rural and urban districts have begun. We need to get back online the service scholarships that will allow our young people to go to college and come out as teachers. And I want to say that young people of color are most hit in terms of deciding not to go to college right now because they cannot figure out how to afford it while they're trying to support their families. We need to get if you will teach, we should pay for your education and get those young people in and get them into our schools where we know that they are going to make a difference. We need to continue to advocate around community schools. We have some places, Los Angeles, Oakland, a number of other places around the state where wraparound services are being provided for kids, the healthcare, the mental health care. Instead of a bureaucracy, a gauntlet of bureaucracies that families have to get through to get services, they organize it so that kids get what they need and then they can be present and be ready to learn. And we've had wonderful success with the models that have been developed. There's $40 million in the budget to at least continue what's there, but we need more. We need to be where Maryland and New York are, where they have a formula funding for high poverty schools to have the wraparound services as a matter of course. And that's an area where ongoing advocacy is really essential. We're going to need to continue to replace punitive policing with culturally responsive training where there are people in schools in that role, and also with restorative practices school-wide. And then I want to just say at the local level, we want to bring students back, and we are bringing students back. I've been really heartened by the stories I'm hearing from superintendents and principals and teachers and parents and kids themselves about what a good start to the school year so many kids have had, because so many of you have just invented and created and designed new ways of doing school. You've trained teachers over the course of the summer. You've created platforms. that people can use online. We've got Zoom rooms and Zoom breakout rooms and chat rooms and one-on-one instruction and small group instruction happening in districts around the state. I know that Los Angeles is also offering free online tutoring for any student who needs it, assembling volunteers and others, AmeriCorps and other volunteers to do that. And I also know that you've been really leading with social emotional learning, with outreach to families and homes. We don't want to lose that when we get back to school in person. We want to keep those practices in place. We want to bring students in, use an assessment of their learning and living situations so that we can wrap around them and help establish the trust and the sense of community that they need to be able to engage in school, use formative assessments to figure out where they are and accelerate their progress. All of the formative assessments that we issued in guidance at the CDE probably about a month or so ago, that are approved in California, come with curriculum and instructional materials and packages tied to them, so that we don't need to tell kids that they're behind. We don't need to start with a deficit framing that says you're below and we're going to put you off in a remediation corner or hold you back. Because as we know, kids' views about themselves as learners drive a lot of their achievement. We want to say, we're glad you're back. We're going to figure out where you are, and we are going to accelerate your learning throughout this school year and use those tools to be able to do it. In some places, people are designing acceleration academies for the breaks and using extended learning time, either after school, during the breaks, and even planning for summer school next year, where teachers who are among the best teachers are asked to, teach, obviously, with adequate compensation. The kids who in small groups are furthest from where we want them to be, and really move them forward, both fill in the gaps, but also pre-teach what they're going to encounter when they come back, so they start really in the middle of successful practice in the classroom. All of those things are things that I know are already going on. I watch what's happening in the districts that you lead. It's very inspiring. And as you continue the work that CAAASA has been doing for so long, I do want to leave you with the words of Congressman Gus Hawkins, whom, as you know, represented the people of Los Angeles in the California Assembly for 30 years, and then in the House of Representatives for 30 years. He had a quiet way about him of working tirelessly for quality education, good jobs at good wages, fair housing, civil rights. He helped advance many of the laws and policies that improve the standards of living for millions of children, people of color, low-income families, and others across the country. He brought childcare to California, Title I to the country. Among many other achievements, he launched the National Council on Educating Black Children, which is a sister organization to CAAASA, ably organized by Pam Powell right now, and with Bobby Scott as our spiritual leader. But Gus said many years ago, he said, the leadership belongs not to the loudest, not to those who beat the drums or blow the trumpets, but to those who day in and day out, in all seasons, work for the practical realization of a better world. Those who have the stamina to persist and remain dedicated, to those belong the leadership. I feel like that describes CAAASA. I thank you for your stamina to persist, to remain dedicated, and to work for the practical realization of a better world. Thank you.
Linda, you are speaking my language. Preach.
I'm talking to you, Michelle.
I am so excited to see you, and you have just so inspired me. I thank you for sharing your words and for really kind of honing in on those 5 things, because those 5 key areas are truly important messages that hopefully all of our listeners and viewers today, I jotted down notes. So I hope that I wasn't the only one jotting down notes this morning, but I cannot thank you enough for setting aside some time to join us and for sharing your very powerful comments and very insightful comments, because you're speaking truth. You are
Thank you.
speaking truth. Thank you so much for joining us. You have a great rest of your day.
You too.
And at this time, I am pleased to introduce someone you probably know very well, Linda, and that's Dr. Daniel Lee, Deputy Superintendent of Equity from the California Department of Education. He is here representing our California State Superintendent, Tony Thurmond. And Dr. Lee, it took me a minute to figure this out, but I think I did. You are the president-elect of the New Jersey Psychological Association and the principal consultant of, and tell me if I get this right, Insight Psychological Services. I did it. Okay. Developing a model for schools to address the impacts of implicit bias on student achievement. So please join me, CAAASA family, in welcoming Dr. Daniel Lee. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And first, I want to thank the California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, Dwight Bonds and his leadership team for inviting me to speak at the conference. I also want to thank the sponsors, the organizers, the presenters, and for what I'm hearing, more than 1,000 participants. And the one thing I want to let everybody know is that our work around equity is timely and it's needed more than ever. So one of the things that I want to talk about is, when I met with Dwight, he, did what any good educator does. He gave me homework. He said, I need you to sort of talk through, like how do we develop and sustain equitable partnerships? So we had an opportunity to share, and then like any good student, I got ahead of my homework. I was like, okay, so what I'm gonna do is share some of the thoughts from our conversation. So one of the things that I wanna talk about is the idea of creating equitable partnerships. And I wanna really highlight the notion of the power of visibility. And what that means is we have to be conscious of the idea that the more we bring sort of issues related to equity to the forefront, the more we have opportunities to engage people in the change process. And I'm gonna give you two quick examples. So I'm gonna throw in a homegirl reference. So let's talk about Kamala Harris and her VP rollout. If people remember, when they announced that, one of the byproducts for the Biden campaign was they raised the most money in an hour just by saying she's going to be on a ticket. That's the power of visibility. I also want to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. At least this is the first time in my lifetime where I'm seeing a lot of intergroup conversations around racial equity. And the one thing I realize that's different too is that the expectation of change is not just a hope, it's an outcome. Like we get that we have to do things differently. And so what this does is it elevates the energy related to equity, but now it challenges us to do something. And this is where we birth equitable partnerships. It's where we shift from the energy to productive behaviors. So one of the things that I want to remind people is that sustainability is not just an outcome. It has to be an action word for us as we do our work. We have to understand that there's going to be pressure to sustain the status quo. It's going to be pressure to say you had enough, you did enough, there's nothing else available. And then it's going to be our jobs to really encourage everyone to say, we have to move past that point. We have to push the envelope. We have to make sure that our communities get everything they need and deserve. So let me step back and talk a little bit about what we're doing at the department. The superintendent, Superintendent Thurmond, he's asked me to lead some of the internal work around equity in the department, as well as some external projects. And he has a basic saying that we plan to embed in everything we do. And he wants to know really two things, is what you're doing working and how do you know? And so what we're going to be weaving that thought around sort of our work is around some real issues that's going to impact folks who at least live, work, and breathe education in California. So we're going to be looking at finalizing the ethnic studies curriculum. We're going to be talking about strategies and implementing strategies to reduce disproportionality. We're going to be talking about how do we develop and provide school districts with instructional change models that are embedded in cultural responsive frameworks. We want to also talk about the idea that we got to share this with everybody. Like it just can't be reserved for a few. And the expectation is all of our communities are going to be living and breathing sort of equitable societies and school communities. And finally, we have to do some work in our own house. We have to make sure that our staff is not only engaged in this work to partner and work with each other, but to be better partners to our school and other school partners and stakeholders in the community. And then I want to talk about another sort of aspect of creating equitable communities, and that's kind of group norms. And I think one of the things that we need to understand is that our work has two levels. It's hard work where we gotta just get in there and do, but it's also hard work. You know, it's that space that calls us, the passion, the energy. And what that means is we have to really understand that part of our experience means we're going to get messy, and that we're going to be in spaces where we have to have, you know, there's so many terms for these conversations now. You can have a deliberate conversation, a courageous conversation, an unconventional conversation when we're talking about just things that are difficult in our systems. But the point is, we always have to be okay with bringing that up. But it isn't just our burden. The system needs to be cultivated to continue to ask those questions. And I want to give you an example about how we need to be conscious of including everyone in the room. For those who aren't familiar with California's educational system, we have 3 state schools, 2 schools for the deaf and 1 school for the blind. And we're doing all of this work around trying to figure out how to diversify the teaching community. We want to increase the number of teachers of color that are in our systems. I want to know how many people know that the deaf community is suffering from the same issue. They can't find enough deaf educators who are people of color. And so what we have to understand is everybody is sharing some of the same struggles. But are we talking about every population? Are we including everybody? And are we sharing resources and ideas to uplift everyone? So it really is making sure that everybody is in the room. And now I want to take another step and kind of shift to how do we sustain equitable partnerships? And what I mean by that is how do we keep doing that hard work of having those conversations and developing those plans and ideals to keep equity, diversity, and inclusion in front of people. And that requires a level of perseverance. And I want to be conscious of that it can be fatiguing and tiring. But that's where the hard work comes in. And that's where the sense of community and engaging people comes in. Like we can't do this alone. And we have to keep working on building those strategies and those partnerships to make things come alive. So we also have to work at creating a new normal, because before, you know, like equity, diversity, and inclusion was the office over there. So now, you know, one of my charges for the department is how am I integrating it within all of the programs, that it becomes a vibrant part of the way we think and operate. That's a new normal. And I think what we want to talk about is we have to continue to create new normal. So if I can give you some quick tips about what you should include in your new normal is 1, be open and honest about having transparent and authentic communication. And that means silence is no longer an option. You know, a lot of us think that, you know, when we hear off the cuff remarks or people are saying things that, you know, they don't deserve, that we just have to be still and be quiet about it. Going to those days. And I think what we have to understand is that we have to be empowered to really make sure that everybody in the room is represented and considered. And again, that could be some hard work, but we have to be conscious about, you know, incorporating that as a new way of living. Next, be context specific. And what I mean by that is do you. It's like you have to really create goals and opportunities that make sense for you and your community. So all of the strategies I just talked about in California may or may not relate to your community, and that's fine. But what you want to do is make sure you're measuring your success based on the impact you're having in your community. And that's going to be relevant to you because diversity and equity and inclusion partnerships are going to be as different as the colors in a rainbow. And that's okay, because that's how unique we are. And that's how unique our communities are. And that's how unique our work is. So find your space and lane and just measure the impact. I mean, that should be the challenge. And lastly, I want to talk about the ideal that we have to persevere and be intentional about persevering. When I got married over 20-something years ago, I had some friends tell me, you know, you and your wife need to make a commitment that divorce is not an option. And I was just like, okay, what does all this mean? And pretty much what they were talking about is you're going to ride and die, come what may. And, you know, and one of the things you have to think about with sustaining partnerships is that should be an expectation. Number one, we need to understand that every relationship and partnership is going to be messy. We need to understand that we can overcome the messiness. But at the same time, that's where that perseverance comes through. And we need to also understand that we're working to develop and create empowered communities. And that should be one of the primary byproducts of equitable partnerships, that everybody in the room is still empowered to share, to relate, to communicate, and to voice their concerns and expect that their ideals will be integrated. And we should be able to sustain that moving forward, because differences don't necessarily mean the end or the demise of a relationship. And finally, I wanted to share this one thought, that we need to remember to capture all of the magic in your moments. Because primarily we need to celebrate this process, and that'll bring us the joy we need to keep moving forward. So thank you, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Dr. Lee, amazing. So welcome to the wonderful state of California. And you have your work cut out for you, but I am excited you're the right man for the job. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning and for your powerful words and message. That is wonderful. I look forward to working with you.
Thank you, I do too.
This is going to be great. Dr. Kim, it has been a wonderful morning. It has been a powerful, busy morning. Lots of great messages that have been shared. And the good part of it is that it's all going to be on our CAAASA YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm.
So just a reminder to all of our viewers, again, a thank you for choosing to join us this morning. You will be receiving an evaluation via email and an opportunity to subscribe to our CAAASA channel so that you can go back and reconnect to some of this powerful stuff later on and share it again in the future with colleagues. But thank you for joining. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Camp, for closing remarks. Thank you.
Goodness. Thank you, Dr. Bowers. Appreciate it. I look forward to turning over the presidency to you. So CAAASA will be in great hands, definitely. So just want to say thank you again. I know we're closing. We are at time. Like Dr. Bowers said, subscribe to the YouTube channel and continue to look back at our webpage as well, so you can become not only aware of CAAASA, but engage with CAAASA. Consider attending the Leadership Academy events, the Professional Development Program Event Summit that we will have in May this year, and then consider joining CAAASA and joining one of the exciting committees so you can get your hands dirty and really involved in this work.